Greetings, everyone. We'll get started. My name is David Sandalow. I am the Inaugural Fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I am thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar, which is on the topic of the food system and how the food system can contribute to ambition on climate change. Important and timely topic for a number of reasons that we're going to be discussing today. We have a fantastic group of panelists and speakers. This event is being webcast live. The full video is going to be available in several days on the website of the Center on Global Energy Policy. For those of you who are participating via Zoom, you can submit a question in the Q&A, which we will turn to after our speakers talk. Let me just quickly introduce our speakers. We have 4 of them today. Bill Hohenstein, who's the Director of the Office of Energy and Environmental Policy at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Cynthia Rosenzweig, Senior Research Scientist at NASA Goddard Institute, co-leader of AgMIP and lead author of the Food Security Chapter of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Philippe Benoit, Adjunct Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, whose distinguished career includes senior positions at the International Energy Agency and World Bank. And David Wallerstein, whose day job is Chief Exploration Officer at Tencent, a noted global leader on this issue, an author who's written Re-Architecting Earth, producer of the film Day Zero, and somebody whose advice and support is something that we've really valued enormously at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Let me start by briefing you on a report that we issued yesterday, which is called a Food and Climate Change Info Guide. And I'm going to pull up some slides. And hopefully you can see this. So yesterday, the Center on Global Energy Policy issued its first info guide. The purpose of this info guide is to provide basic facts, authoritative and reliable facts on this topic of food and climate change. And here's the outline of what we produced. The food system, we provide background on the food system first, then on climate change, then on the food system's impacts on climate change, then on climate change impacts on the food system, and then on strategies for reducing emissions and improving resilience. Our co-authors, some of whom are on this call, or on this in this webinar, are from Columbia, AgMIP, New York University. Together we've formed something we call the Food Climate Partnership, which is a group of researchers from those institutions and others working together to address the issue of issues related to the nexus of food and climate change. So I'll just give a basic summary of this info guide, and I urge you to go find it on our website. Part 1 of our info guide talks about the food system, and it provides basic facts on the food system. And I've just picked out a couple to give you a sense of what we do. Main crops, over 40% of human calories come directly from 3 crops: rice, wheat, and maize. We talk about food loss and waste. Roughly 1/3 of food that's produced is never consumed. This food is either lost in the field or on the way to the consumer, or wasted in institutional settings, stores, homes, or restaurants. And because we're an energy center, we particularly focus on the energy aspects of the food system. And the food system and energy system, we note, are deeply intertwined. Roughly 30% of global energy consumption comes from the food system. Our info guide contains this diagram of the food system, which we hope you'll study and find useful, but I'm not going to pause on it here, but it shows the many linkages between different parts of the food system, which is complex. We then provide a climate change overview. Just some basic facts. Atmospheric concentrations of heat trapping gases are now higher than at any time in human history. This is changing the Earth's climate. All the facts are sourced to reliable, authoritative sources. The 7 warmest years on record have been the past 7 years. And importantly, the world is not on a path to meeting globally agreed climate change goals. Policies currently in place would result in a global average temperature increase of 2.9 degrees C, which is, for those of you who grew up in the United States, more than 5 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. And this is actually not in the info guide, but I thought it would be interesting to to many of you. This is a computer projection of what Miami, Florida will look like after 2 degrees C, which is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit of global warming. Global warming causes sea level rise, and coastal cities all over the world, definitely including Miami, are severely threatened by climate change. It's important to note, as I just said, the world is not currently on a path to avoid this amount of global warming. We then provide a summary of the food system's impacts on climate change. Just some quick facts: more than 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. Roughly 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions result from producing, shipping, storing, and processing food that's lost or wasted. And roughly 15% of global emissions of heat-trapping gases come from livestock. In general, animal-based food products are associated with higher emissions than plant-based foods. And we provide a graph, which I'll jump over. Climate change impacts on the food system is our next section, and this is hugely important. The buildup of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere suppresses global average crop yields. Increasing concentrations of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere have negative impacts on the nutritional quality of globally important crops, and subsistence farmers were particularly vulnerable to climate change. And we show a chart from a Nature article on the nutritional impact of climate change on important crops, and then end with a section on strategies for reducing emissions and improving resilience. We're talking about supply-side strategies, demand-side strategies, and improving resilience. And it's a pretty high-level discussion, but we hope it'll be useful for people, particularly who are just trying to get a basic grounding in this topic. So this is our food and climate change info guide. You can find it on the website of the Center on Global Energy Policy or the Food Climate Partnership website at www.foodclimatepartnership.org. And we hope it'll provide a useful foundation for further conversations going forward. So with that, I am really thrilled to bring in our first speaker, who is a senior leader at the US Department of Energy, Bill Hohenstein. Bill, as I said earlier, is director of the Office of Energy and Environmental Policy at the US Department of Agriculture, a veteran working on these issues. I've benefited from his advice on these topics for many, many years, as I know have many others in Washington. And Bill, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, David. I'm happy to be here. It's always nice to virtually visit Columbia.
Well, we hope we can do it in person sometime soon, and the world may be returning to something approaching normal. Bill, you know, the issue of climate change and agriculture is getting a lot of attention in DC these days. I think, you know, I've been paying attention to this for a number of years. I've never seen it get more attention from the White House and or senior leadership at USDA. Could you just kind of share your thoughts about President Biden's policies and Secretary Vilsack's policies and what's going on with climate and agriculture in Washington?
Well, we're busy. We're very, very busy right now, David. So sort of top down, you know, the president came in, made a couple of big announcements just in the first week that the US was rejoining the Paris Agreement, and then laid out a broad strategy and an executive order to address the climate crisis at home and abroad. And since then, he's held a leaders summit that was just in the last week, where he brought together leaders, and the US has announced a new commitment under the Paris Agreement, our nationally determined contribution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. And I mentioned this executive order on addressing the climate crisis. There's quite a bit in there that's guiding our work at USDA. And so first off, we're looking at policies and measures where we can incentivize farming practices that are climate smart. These are practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, sequester carbon, generate renewable energy, and make the agricultural system more resilient to climate change, while still improving productivity so we can continue to meet the growing world population. So quite a challenge, but there's a whole arsenal of technologies and practices that we've been developing over the last couple of years. Also, activities in the forest sector to improve forest health, to reduce wildfire risk, and to reforest lands that are marginal for other uses. So quite a bit in there. That's sort of the what. The how we go about it is where the challenge comes in and where some of the opportunities are. Quite a bit of interest in the private sector, partnering with agriculture, a lot of interest in both agricultural offsets, but also things where we can make the supply chain more sustainable. So we're certainly aware that consumers are demanding more climate-friendly goods and services. And there's the role to tap into that. So we can work with companies like Walmart or other companies, General Mills, General Foods, Land O'Lakes, companies that are making corporate commitments to reduce emissions, where they have a relationship with farmers. They can partner with the farmers, help the farmers kind of get over the hump in terms of putting in these new practices and technologies, reduce the emissions of the feedstocks and the goods that they're purchasing so that consumers will get end-use products that are more climate friendly and more sustainable. So quite a challenge, a lot of work to do to connect the dots. A lot of it has to do with accounting and making sure we're confident in the benefits. So when we're making a claim, folks can have confidence that we're standing behind it. So we're looking at a number of different things: federal incentives, private incentives, supply chain efforts, offsets, and all of these things together are going to be used to help really transform the agricultural sector in the United States. That's the plan.
There's a lot to follow up on there, Bill. I mean, thank you for that summary. And just one piece, I noticed the president actually talked about cover crops in his address to Congress last week. I don't know that the president of the United States has ever talked about cover crops in an address to Congress. Could you talk about why that was so important that the president would actually be mentioning it?
Well, that's just one of the suite of practices, but it's one that currently has a very low adoption rate. So roughly just under 5% of farmers in the US use cover crops. And cover crops basically allow the field to stay covered over the winter. They grow over the winter and spring and basically build up organic matter in the soil, and then they will decompose and actually further organic matter in the soil. So they can be very effective at enhancing soil health, improving soil carbon in the context of growing crops. And so that combined with conservation tillage and no-till, combined with addressing fertilizer, using more efficient fertilizers, using delayed release fertilizers, using precision application of fertilizers, that suite of practices can really have a significant impact in reducing net greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's sort of the arsenal of practices I'm talking about when we're saying what should farmers do to be more climate friendly. So it's great to hear the president talk about cover crops. Really important technology. Currently, not many farmers are using it, so there's a lot of potential. But it's just part of a broader suite of practices.
I noticed at the President's Summit too, he made an announcement about the Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate. What is that?
Yeah, this is the aim for climate. So, Agricultural Innovation Mission. So basically, it starts with this is a global problem, right? We're going to need it. It's not just, if the U.S. addresses the ag sector, it's not going to be part of the solution. So that's part of it. So we need to be able to build partnerships, effective partnerships with countries, and that current technologies are not enough. That the key to being effective in working our way out of this challenge is through innovation. So basically continuing to push the envelope to create feeds that we can provide to ruminant animals to reduce methane emissions, to generate new technologies to capture methane from manure, generating the technologies that many areas of the world are going to need to sustainably produce crops, given the rapid pace that we're going to see in terms of climate change. So we're going to see a lot of climate change over the next 50 years. Many countries are not well prepared to address that, especially in the ag sector. And so this global effort to focus on innovation and research and technology is going to be part of the solution. We have strong partnerships from the UAE, from the Gates Foundation, from the UK government, other governments, So we did sort of a soft announcement at the President Summit. We're planning to follow up with the Food System Summit, which will be in September, and then a formal launch of the initiative at the COP in Scotland in November. So a busy year ahead of us, building this coalition, a lot of excitement around it, and some pretty strong partners.
One more question for now, and then come back. We'll do more questions after other speakers talk. But you mentioned accounting, and I know there's a lot of, I think, skepticism about the ability to accurately measure the carbon in soil and whether that, the current science is adequate for compensation programs or trading programs, that type of thing. Could you comment on that and where USDA is on that? What USDA is doing about it?
So this is an area where I'm pretty optimistic, and I tend to be maybe even a little contrarian, because I know there is a lot of skepticism out there when it comes to, can we measure these soil carbon benefits, and do we really understand what's going on? And my view is that, unlike emission reductions, when we're talking about storing additional carbon in the soils, it's going to accumulate. And so over time, that carbon needs to be there. And so it may be difficult to measure a small change in carbon over a year. But when you think about the accumulation over 10 years or 20 years, we should be able to count for that. And because that carbon is accumulating, it gets easier and easier to detect these changes over time. So that's one. I think there is a lot of variability within soils, and so there's a lot of variability in the soil carbon numbers. But when we're thinking about not just doing it on a plot, but doing it on not just tens of thousands of acres, but millions of acres. We have 190 million acres of cultivated lands, or so we're talking about doing this at a large scale. The ability to sample, the ability to understand what's happening on average and apply that to the landscape. A lot of those uncertainties go down. So there are some challenges with measuring soil carbon, no doubt. There are certainly uncertainties and a lot of variability field to field, but there are also some things where if we use statistics, we think about this as a large scale problem. And then we also recognize that the carbon's accumulating and gets easier to measure over time. It's a little less daunting.
Great. Maybe we'll come back to that. I bet there'll be some questions from the audience on this topic. It's a really important one. Let me bring in my Columbia. Thank you, Bill. Let me bring in my Columbia colleague, Cynthia Rosenzweig, who, as I said earlier, she's senior research scientist at NASA Goddard Institute in the Columbia Earth Institute. She is co-leader of AgMIP, the Agricultural Modeling Intercomparison and Improvement Project. Did I get that right,
yes,
Cynthia?
You're going to hear a lot more about it.
Good. Okay. And lead author of a really important chapter on this topic by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Hey. Hello, everybody. I'm sharing screen, and I'll get going. Thank you, David. There we go. I'm going to share some advances that are happening on the research side of the food system and climate change. One of the big things is that this food system approach is really taking hold. It's not just agriculture anymore. It's really all the way from production, supply chains that Bill Hohenstein was talking about, to the consumption, dietary choices, and then back through food loss and waste to the production systems themselves. And so I'm going to be talking about AgMIP, which stands for the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project. From now on, we'll just call it AgMIP. And I'll share a little bit more about what that is. But it's great for AgMIP to be part of the Food Climate Partnership, linking with policy experts, in particular other experts, but the policy, so that the research and the policy can be really integrated from the beginning. So one of the things that we've done with the Food Climate Partnership is create this nifty new diagram of the food system. because each one of these small boxes has a role to play both in the whole food system. Also, it has a role to play on emissions of greenhouse gases, and many of them also have a role to play on developing resilience in the system as well. So we're thinking about the full system, what's happening in the pre-production before things even actually get planted on the in the field, and what about deforestation to actually clear the land for the field. All the production side of both crops and livestock, but the post-production, processing, packaging, all of these things affect the interactions of climate change, both on the emissions and mitigation side and the resilience side. You see the diets and consumption and the food loss and waste disposal. So that's what we are working on night and day in AgMIP and the Food System Partnership. So this is a new paper that's coming out in mid-May. And some of the new work that we are doing, Francesco Tupiello is the lead author from FAO. And we are, based on all those boxes that I just showed you, improving the calculations of the greenhouse gas emissions. So we're not going to go too much into the gory details. And Philippe, the next speaker, is going to be telling more about the differences between the developed countries and the developing countries. But just want to highlight the two biggest things on this graph. First of all, the enteric fermentation between the 1990 and 2018 is increasing overall. And this is really important because of what David was sharing from the info guide, that 15% of total greenhouse gases from the food system come from livestock. And you can see that the developing countries are increasing in their enteric fermentation. That's the belching of, for example, the methane from beef and dairy. But as development occurs and changes in diet and adopting more meat-based diets, this leads to more greenhouse gas emissions. The second big point of this graph is, of course, what's happening with the net forest conversion. And this is actually a good news story. There's been a 30% decrease in net forest conversion. And again, this is happening primarily, somewhat in the developed countries, but primarily in the developing countries as well. So this is really a good news story that forests are not being destroyed for agricultural production as much over this time period. That's a really important trend. But on the other side, so that's on the causation side of the food system and climate change. But there's also, of course, the impact side and the need for resilience. And here, it's not just in the future that climate change is going to affect the food system. The climate change is affecting the food system already right now in food availability. In some places, there are actual declines in yields. There's also declines in yields, in yield increases that are climate, the negative climate effects are holding back increases in yields, for example. There's also tremendous problems with food access caused by extreme events. For example, the heat wave in Eastern Europe and Russia caused a global food price spike. There's also effects on the quality of food because warming winters affect the quality of fruit. And some fruits, for example, apples, this is an example from Japan. And then the stability of food is being affected, recalling the extreme flooding in Pakistan, leading to, in 2010, leading to massive loss of food reserves. So climate change and the food system is not just something that's going to happen in the future, it's happening now. And but what AgMIP does, one of the things that AgMIP does is it makes the projections that are included in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on with multi-model approaches to make these kinds of maps showing where models agree on impacts on food, not only in the US, but globally. And here, the combination of multiple crop and multiple climate models show, you can see those reds and yellows, especially in maize and wheat, that the lower latitudes where the developing countries lie are more vulnerable to climate change. So now I want to quickly do a flying tour of AgMIP and how we want to help, and particularly in the US. So AgMIP is a network of more than 1,000 agricultural modelers worldwide, and there's over 200 modelers here in the United States. And what we do is we convene leading groups to conduct these multi-model assessments of biophysical and economic impacts of practices, technologies, and incentives for current and future climate conditions. And the way we do that is with what we call AgMIP participatory system science. So we're not just in our, in front of our computers running models all the time. We are sharing with and interacting with stakeholders to find out what's important to the decision makers. And then we construct the assessments based on what the actual decision-making needs are. Then we have tons of data, multiple models. We develop these protocols that multiple groups can share and use, doing simulations, analysis, and evaluation to really create this solution space around whatever we are assessing. So one thing that we are developing is beginning to develop protocols for helping out the programs on climate smart practices that Bill was just describing. So we are developing bringing together the agriculture and climate modeling communities to be engaged to conduct some critical carbon and GHG baselines, not just at the farm scale, but as Bill was saying, as it gets to be the region scale and the national scale assessments, and support and backstop the models that USDA is using in the incentive programs, for example. And these will be critical, we feel, to ensure and demonstrate that these that build the confidence, as Bill is saying, that can for example, the carbon sequestration programs. So up at the top, you see some of these are the US land grant universities that are members of the consortium, along with Columbia University, to provide evidence-informed options, to develop and use of science-based tools. This is one of the technologies that Bill was talking about, modeling and simulation. So you can test these technologies beforehand, see which will work and which maybe won't work quite so well as we go to scale up the transformation of agriculture. And then really develop these producer-enabled choices of technologies and practices. So just a final pitch on AgMIP, which is really no single models or set of models will meet the need for this transformation. What AgMIP does is we convene, it's a new kind of science, really, diverse modeling efforts, which then we can really find the very best across communities of scientists to help out on this, both national and international efforts, because we do this not only in the US, but we do this worldwide. So thank you, David, back to you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for your great leadership on these issues. And we'll come back with some questions after the next round of talks. And I want to right now bring in our colleague, Philippe Benoit, who, as I said earlier, is a research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, has worked in senior positions at the International Energy Agency and at the World Bank, among other places, and a global leader on particularly the impact of the food system on development in developing countries. Philippe, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot. Let me share my screen. share screen's working.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to build on some of the very important points that Cynthia made, as well as some of the points regarding the overall structure that David presented in terms of the initial presentation of the info guide. And as David mentioned, what I'm going to do is in some ways really look at this more through the prism of development, which builds on some of the work that I do at Columbia on the issue of energy for development. But here the issue is really food emissions and development. And in many ways, we're fortunate in terms of the timing of this presentation, because we just had two important reports, one which is about to be issued in May by our colleague Tubiello, and another one that was previously issued last month by AgMIP, which give us some more data in terms of what is happening in order to enable us to get a better breakdown in terms of the food emissions story. Now, what you have here is what emissions have looked like on the top line for developed countries, which are Annex 1 countries, because they're listed in an annex to the climate agreement. And what you see in the top graph is emissions per capita. And so what you see is a decrease in emissions per capita over time from 1990 to 2020. And on the bottom line, what you see consistent with that is a relatively plateauing and slight reduction in emissions. But what is interesting is to compare that to what's happening in what are known as non-Annex 1 countries, which are basically developing countries. And there you see a slightly different story, and different in important ways. The first thing is that per capita emissions are actually much lower in developing countries. But what you see in the bottom graph is that those emissions have been increasing in absolute terms, in part because population has been increasing. So when we think about what's happening in terms of the food systems, what's reflected in these graphs is the fact that we need to analyze it in some ways differently when we look at different development groupings. Here you have a list of the top 10 emitters in terms of food system emissions. China being the largest, followed by Indonesia, which has a lot in part because of its palm oil and the like, and then the US. But what's interesting is to look at these figures in terms of where do they fall on this distinction between different types of countries from a development perspective. And here what we've done is we've distinguished between high income countries, which are basically advanced economies in Europe and the United States, North America, from upper middle income countries, where the income is basically 4,000 to 12,500. That includes a China and Indonesia, a Mexico and a Brazil. Lower middle income countries, India and Zambia, and low income countries, which are countries that have income per capita below 1,000. And what you see reflected in this list is the heavy weight of upper middle income countries and the important weight of high income countries. In fact, when we try to see what's happening as a general proposition, looking across all countries within these categories, what we see is that upper middle income countries have in total generated the largest amount of food system emissions. Now, this is based on data from 2015, but it hasn't really changed very much, followed then by lower middle income countries, then high income countries and low income countries. So it's useful in some ways to think about where the emissions are coming from and how they relate to the particular development status of a particular country. And I'm going to come back to this because this is a dynamic situation. Now, often, as we all know, when we think about climate change, obviously things are handled primarily at a national level. So it's interesting to see in which countries you can see a large level of food system emissions within national level economies. And the green shaded are countries where you have a lot of food system emissions within the national total. Blue is 20 to 30, and then the lighter yellows are a smaller amount. And again, not surprisingly, what we tend to see is in some of the poorer countries, we see that food system emissions represent a bigger share of national emissions. Again, if we take this categorization, this is really from the World Bank's, the way they divide different countries, we see a very high percentage of national emissions in low income and lower middle income countries, i.e. countries in both cases that have less than $4,000 per capita income per year, being very substantial, and lower amounts in upper and middle income and high income countries. But one of the implications of this is that for all countries, and in particular, low and lower middle income countries, to the extent that they're going to be exploring how to reduce their own emissions. Eventually, food system is something they're going to have to pay attention to. But at a global level, what is really in some ways probably more important is what is happening in terms of per capita, because obviously what we see reflected here is not only do a lot of people live in upper middle income countries, but we also see as incomes rise from the lower levels to upper middle income and high income levels, the food system emissions per capita increase. Now, this is particularly important when we look at demographics. What you have in this graph here on the vertical side are population, and on the horizontal side are different categories of income levels, which the World Bank uses to classify countries. And so, for example, from 0 to 1,000 is a low-income country, and you only have about 700 million people who live in low-income countries. From 1,000 to 3,000, 4,000 are lower middle-income countries. And you can see here the total population is over 3 billion. One reason is because you have India in this group. From 4,000 to 12,500 are upper middle income countries. Here you have about 3 billion people. One reason is you have China, but you also have a Mexico, you have a Brazil. So you have a lot of important large countries here. And then you have high income countries. And the point that I'd like to draw your attention to here is that basically most high income countries where you have about over 1.25 billion people are in Europe and other countries where the income per capita is over $20,000. One of the things to recognize is that this is not a static situation. In fact, if we go back to the low income category, about 25 years ago, there probably would have been over 2 billion people living there because China and India used to be low income countries 25 years ago. And so we also need to think about where they will live. And what we're seeing on the one hand is rising incomes, successes at poverty alleviation. So more and more people moving from the low income countries into lower and upper middle income countries. And then at the same time, an expectation that we're going to have 1.7 billion more people in the world by 2050. And most of them will be born in countries that are now low income and lower middle income. So this dynamic situation is very important to take into account when we think about food system emissions. So China in some ways helps to illustrate this. If we compare what China was like in 1990 to 2015, in 1990 they were a low income country. Now they're an upper middle income country on their way to become developed. Over that period, their food system emissions rose by 41% in absolute terms. Their food system emissions per capita also rose, but interestingly enough, their food system emissions as a share of their national emissions dropped from 51% to 19% as they industrialized, as more and more people started to drive cars and emit there or manufacturing and the like. But they are now a top emitter of food system emissions. So critical players when we think about decarbonization, and critical as they think about getting to carbon neutrality to deal with their food system. Just a related point is when we look at other countries, we've seen a 50% increase in energy emissions in agriculture in Africa and Latin America and Asia as part of mechanization. So these dynamics of development are very important to bear in mind. What I'd like to do is, in some sense, come back to this diagram that we had before and look at some of these issues more through the development prism. So, for example, dietary choices. What we see is that this is a dynamic situation, and in particular, when we look at these upper middle income countries, where you have high income per capita, a large population, what you see over time is that the preference for beverages and processed food increases significantly, and these are projections into the future, in part a reflection of increasing affluence and changing dietary preferences. In high income countries, you see more stabilization, in some points, ultra-processed food, almost a reduction as dietary preferences change. When we look at waste, there's a lot of discussion about waste and the way we can help in terms of reducing emissions by looking at waste. But that is very much something that tends to be focused, again, on upper middle income countries and high income countries. The fact of the matter is, what is critical from a development perspective, in particular for poorer people, is the issue of food loss, is reducing the amount of loss in terms of what is produced on the farm that farmers cannot either eat or market. And in that regard, efforts to reduce food loss can have impact in terms of climate, because, for example, one thing that people look at is are ways to increase the cold chain, refrigeration, so that more of what is produced on poor farms can make it to a market, and other aspects. So when we're thinking about the interplay between food, emissions, and development, it's important to very much bear in mind some of the challenges there. Another area is food preparation. There's been a lot of talk about how people use natural gas and emissions related to that. But when we talk about food preparation, the big development issue, and reflected in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, is the issue of universal access to clean cooking, or more importantly, how many people lack it. 2.6 billion people today still lack access to clean cooking technologies. About 2.4 of them rely on solid biomass. And some of providing access to clean cooking technologies actually involves giving them access to LPG, which is obviously moving them off of biomass to a fossil fuel, but clearly important development and poverty issues that we need to deal with. So just in conclusion, a few thoughts. When we're thinking about food system emissions, and developing countries, important poverty challenges remain that have to be dealt with. There is also changing pressure on food system emissions across the developing world, notably from growing population, as I mentioned earlier, especially in lower and lower middle income countries. There have also been successes in poverty alleviation and raising incomes, which tend to move people from country categories where we had lower income per capita consumption and emissions to higher levels, as well as changing dietary preferences and the like. And one fact I didn't talk about that's also relevant is increasing urbanization, and of course, technological advancements. We continue to need green revolutions. We'll need a low carbon green revolution. But sort of as a final thought, when we think about what the food system of the future needs to look like, when we're thinking about planning for a net zero by 2050 or 2060, we have to think about a world with a population of over 9.5 billion people. It's not just about adaptation, deforestation, palm oil, and other issues. We also have to think about how do we reduce emissions out of the system. And to do that, we're going to need a lot more research. Thank you very much.
Philip, thank you for that incredibly rich presentation and for all your research on this topic. I'm now thrilled to bring in David Wallerstein. David, as I said before, is the Chief Exploration Officer at Tencent, but beyond that, he's the author of a really important book, Re-Architecting Earth, producer of the movie Day Zero. David, welcome. Thrilled you could be here with us.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? Are these working?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Okay.
That's tremendous. So David, we first met, you were talking about the food, energy, water nexus, and you're really a global leader on the food, energy, water nexus. Why did that nexus seize your attention? Why do you think it's important for all of us?
Yeah, so we actually developed a term at Tencent called FEW, F-E-W, to help just everyday people remember this idea, because it's a lot to think about when you're not just talking about food, agriculture, energy, and water, but you want to have a concept around it. So we started saying FEW because it's like one word, and maybe it'll catch on sooner than later. I would say we've done quite a bit, particularly in our home market of China, to talk about FEW and around the world, but it takes a while to catch on. I think where we've made the most progress is really exploring different artificial intelligence related applications that can help drive productivity in these areas when they're cognizant of each other. And let me explain what this means. So on one hand, when you think about new technology, on one hand, you have your challenges that need to be addressed. And when we think of climate change, we think of food, energy, and water as being the primary drivers of the challenge of climate change that we're facing. And also what must be solved in the circumstance of an increasingly complex world where we're trying to ensure human resilience in the context of climate change. And what do we need to solve? Most importantly, we must solve our food, energy, and water needs. So it's both what's causing our challenges today and both what we need to solve in the future as probably our highest priority. And even you could argue human health is greatly related to resilience in this core area of FEW. Okay, so we start with our challenge area. Then once you know what you're trying to attack in the world, this is what we need to unleash our technologies on. All of the revolutions we're seeing around us, artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. We need to make sure that humanity is focusing the development of our technologies on that. So let me give you an example of how this could apply to what we're talking about today with, let's say, the food system, the global food system. We have found both with outdoor agriculture and with indoor agriculture that when you apply sophisticated data solutions using, you know, a lot of data and artificial intelligence, that you can not only become more resourceful and efficient in how you're applying resources to get your targeted outcome, a certain crop coming off the vine, off the tree, but also you can actually become more productive. So what we're finding is that when you apply AI, that we're actually boosting productivity and using less resources at the same time. And this is very, very important at this time in history where we're needing to expend less, whether it's fertilizer, water, the energy needed to transport that water, and so on and so forth. Everything is a resource. Human time is a resource. Every single thing is a resource. And what we're trying to do is get more avocados, get more fruit, whatever that output is. We can be extremely systematic and clear about what our target is with the food system. We want crops, right? And we want them tasty, beautiful, all of that, as quick as possible, but with that targeted output. We're finding that when you solve simultaneously, you're also solving for reducing water usage. And in some cases, for almonds, for example, or avocados, you may actually be reducing your water usage by up to 40% while increasing your productivity. So what I'm saying is that, unfortunately, many farmers around the world, as well-intentioned as they may be, are often completely wasting water and not optimizing the health of their plants because they're not using these tools to systematically identify the health of their plants. They have practices that have gone down through generation. Everyone's got their own practices. But we found this is the benefit, again, of using sensors and intelligence in these solutions where you're optimizing plant health,
I've got some connection problems with David. Lost you for a bit there, David. Are others hearing this? Maybe, David, if you can turn off your camera, that might help, as you are frozen right now.
Am I
There.
back now?
You're back.
Okay. How much
Love to see you, but I think we missed about the last 30 seconds.
No.
You were.
Am I back yet?
You're back. Yep, that's great.
Okay.
I can hear you. That's perfectly. You were. David,
Am I back?
You are back. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about how artificial intelligence with the data can make a difference, and talking about the example of water and almonds.
Oh, yeah. So just to confirm that point, because it sounds like it went out. Sorry, I might repeat myself. I don't know exactly where I cut out, but what I was saying with the example, for example, almonds or avocados, sometimes by optimizing plant health and optimizing for output, farmers, when they deploy these artificial intelligence solutions, may be saving up to 40% of their traditional water expenditure. So they're optimizing for plant health, but organically by optimizing and using these solutions, they're significantly reducing their water. And this is a phenomenon that we believe is going on globally, where farmers, as good intentioned as they may be, may not fully have the tools available for them to understand how the nutrients they're providing, the fertilizer, the water, all the good things that go into creating output is actually maybe not optimizing the health of the plant. So they're expending too much resource. With water, you also have the energy to pump the water, so everything's a resource, and you're not optimizing the productivity. So we're finding time and time again that this example, as applied to agriculture, can provide to a lot of other areas of industrial optimization, where organizations are not optimizing their productivity, and they're wasting simply too much. And so we feel this is a very powerful approach to addressing this challenge of climate change in general.
And from a systems level, David, how do you see this working? Is this something that that small farmers can utilize? How would they get the information, for example, that would help them? Or is this something that really is only helpful for large industrial scale agriculture?
Yeah, well, I think it's possible for any kind of organization to deploy these types of solutions, any type of farmer. But of course, at this early stage of adoption, the prices are higher. Many of these solutions require different types of sensors. So, there's going to be some upfront capital expenditure to buying a certain kind of sensor, even if it's a camera or something that wraps around a trunk of a tree or something like that. The cost themselves isn't usually too high, but for a farmer with a low margin, it can feel prohibitive. And so I feel like around most of the world, there needs to be more support and encouragement, and it could be policy support, tax write-offs. There's so many ways to incentivize a farmer through tax policy. Like, can you deduct this from your revenues and something like that? How do you make this attractive to encourage them to adopt technologies that help them boost productivity and limit waste? And including all the kinds of environmental waste that come from applying too much fertilizer or whatever. So to me, the biggest impediment to rolling out these technologies globally is that farmers basically tend to need help. In some countries, even water-stressed countries, farmers may not even be charged or metered for their water usage. It may not be priced. So you can look at a water-stressed country where you may not even be paying for water, and therefore the incentives for a farmer to save on water, often up to 70% of a national water budget, may not be entirely clear to that farmer. So you really do need policy of different kinds, if you think about this from a global perspective, to encourage efficiency, driving productivity, reducing wastage, and so on and so forth.
David, another technology that's gotten attention is our plant-based meats or cultured meats. And can artificial intelligence help with the development of those? And do you think that those have a role in kind of the future of the food system?
Well, I think innovation that intends to address this challenge we have in the global food system of securing enough protein in a sustainable way, reducing emissions, I think it's important. And I'm personally very supportive of it. I would say, though, as a vegan for maybe 5 to 6 years now, I feel like the most elegant solution is right in front of us, to be honest, which is just, I'm one of those people that would say consuming less meat is very elegant. And sometimes when I look at all the cost and expense to creating new ways of developing meat, noticing how my own desire to eat meat dropped off about 5 years ago, about 2 weeks into my vegan diet experiment, I found I didn't want meat anymore. Sometimes I just don't get what the big deal is. Why is it so hard for people to explore, their own tolerance for diversifying their diet and eating something that's healthier for them, called vegetables or legumes or whatever? So I feel like, yes, like this kind of innovation is helpful. It's very promising, but I think on a massive planetary scale, there's a lot to be said overnight for people just reducing their meat intake and exploring all the vegetable and legume food groups around them. And the main thing is we have to move with urgency. And I feel like that's the thing that can be done right now for most people today. Like, skip the burger, have something else, have chili without the carne. And then, there'll be great entrepreneurs out there building new types of meat, and that'll be interesting, but do something today.
It's interesting, David. I had a very similar experience with my diet at about the same time, actually, and really felt much better as a result of cutting meat out of my diet. I've noticed, we've seen in the United States, actually, in the past week or two, a lot of dialogue about this and a lot of pushback from people who are very, committed to the diet that they've grown up with. It's very meat dependent. So I think it's sometimes called a third rail, meaning it's a very politically sensitive topic.
Yeah, no one wants to be told what to do or not to do. And I feel what's necessary is education about the problem that is devoid of what I just kind of said now. Like, and maybe I'm not saying it the right way. I think we have to learn how to communicate, but like, how do you say, this is a huge global scale problem and you're part of the issue. So think about, the alternatives that you have, because I think it is a tricky issue. I agree.
David, you've produced a film, man of many talents here, and the film is on the water shortage, the global water shortage, which relates to the issues we're talking about. I think my colleagues at the Center on Global Energy Policy are ready to show a short trailer of that film, and then I just want to ask you a question or two about how it relates to what we're talking about today.
Great, thank you. This is called Day Zero.
Water was where life on Earth began. All living creatures depend on it.
What would you do if you know what I know?
Water. It's like the air we breathe. How long can you live without water?
The water crisis is something that's happening now, and it's happening all over the world.
The human population is outstripping the water supply. This is suicidal.
The world's major aquifers are being depleted past sustainability tipping points.
Officials in Cape Town, South Africa say it's just 92 days away from having to shut off most water taps. They are calling April 21st Day Zero.
When we don't have water, people fight. All hell breaks loose.
Secuestran más y más pipas. Entonces, pues ahí solamente nos hacían caso. Con agresión.
No jobs, no vegetables. It becomes unimaginable.
Industrial agriculture is really a mining operation where they use up water. They use it up until it's gone.
The forests function like a heart. Once you take it out, the whole system dies.
I've seen the flow of the springs slow down as if they're tired and getting sick.
There is a need for a philosophical shift away from we are masters and owners of nature to we are now developing in partnership with nature.
Wow, that looks very powerful, David. Are you back? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We launched it in a few markets last Thursday. Very big launch in China, actually, Sweden, Greece, different Middle Eastern countries. So it's coming out around the world. We're working with television broadcasters, so market by market, country by country, and it's very global, as you can hear from my description of the launch just now. It's totally global, and then various markets are coming on at different times. And yeah, we had like first couple days, like 5 million views in China. Great feedback. So it's really the topic is really taking off there in particular. I've been following it quite closely there, and it's a good start.
Well, congratulations on that. And before I bring back in our other panels, just one question. Could you just tie the global water shortage to the issues we're talking about here and kind of food and climate change? And you kind of did that at the beginning of our dialogue, but just how do they relate to each other?
So I actually made this movie as part of my own ongoing research into this water crisis. And I, as a newcomer, not an academic, I'm a business person. I was so shocked about what I was learning about the scope of the challenge, and so I thought, what better way to get more people familiar with this than actually through film, and just sending film crews out to Brazil and South Africa. The movie is called Day Zero, so it was very much inspired by this notion of a city, having the taps turned off. But what the film crew found as they were traveling was actually more of a story about agriculture. The movie morphs into this story about the challenge of global agriculture being manifold. One, a lot of the most productive regions for agriculture on Earth is built on top of aquifers. We talk about the Ogallala aquifer in the Midwest. The experts in the film say that, maybe the Ogallala only has, around 30 years left or so. So, unsustainable practices using, ancient water sources, aquifers that are not being replenished fast enough. And then the issue of deforestation in the Amazon, which of course is, being cleared for agricultural purposes. A lot of that related to livestock, and how that actually is disrupting the flow of water globally, the water system in their region. The Amazon itself, there's more and more data about this coming out all the time, but that has a significant global impact. So we're learning more about how water is traveling around the world, and how these agricultural projects or endeavors that lead to things like deforestation are actually disrupting fundamental water cycles on Earth. So the movie really explores these various themes, and I think it'll be really interesting for the people on today's Zoom event to check it out when it's available in the US. And we're still working on the distribution date and timing and the exact broadcaster in the US. So we'll work with you, David, to get the word out when we have the full details on that.
That sounds great. And I know I haven't seen the list, but our audience usually is people from dozens of countries. So from those of you who are listening from some of the countries that David was just reporting, you can get it now and look forward to being out in the United States, David. Congratulations on the release of this. Let's bring everyone back in. Good. And for those of you who are just joining, my name is David Sandalow, and I'm here with, and I'm at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. I'm here with Bill Hohenstein from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Cynthia Rosenzweig from NASA, Goddard, and AgMIP, Philippe Benoit from the Center on Global Energy Policy, and David Wallerstein, author of AI for Food, Energy, and Water, and Chief Exploration Officer of Tencent. And I guess David has got some bandwidth issues, and so we're gonna see your name but not your face, David, as we talk. But Bill, let me just turn back to you. We got a couple, following our brief exchange on cover crops, we got a few questions in the question and answer. Somebody asked, what are cover crops? And I think that's a fair question. And so maybe we can just quickly answer that question. And then another person asked, why are adoption rates so low? What's led to that?
Sure. So very simply, cover crops are plants that are basically put on the landscape to keep the land covered during the winter. So unlike bare land fallow, which is often what happens in the winter in the United States, a cover crop is usually planted in the fall, will grow over winter, and will grow again in the spring. Usually these are annuals. They're killed by mowing before the season. And so the reason why they're called cover crops is they're not an economic crop. So they're not grown for their economic gain. They're grown basically to reduce soil erosion, to improve soil health, to help with water retention at times. And they also have a really remarkable ability to increase soil carbon.
Mm-hmm. And maybe turning also to the carbon accounting question that we discussed. I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Cynthia, I think are using the platform of AgMIP to look at this issue on soil accounting. I wonder what you think about the science on carbon accounting in soils.
Yeah, I agree with Bill. Basically, there's been a lot of work on this, and with a combination of using samples, and then using the samples to train models, right, to improve the models, and using remote sensing to get the landscape approach. So our AgMIP modelers are confident that we are able to provide, especially with the multi-model approach, to actually then backstop those accounting, the accounting that's needed as part of the programs to incentivize soil carbon.
And we had a question in the chat. You might have seen somebody, or Maynard Clark asked, does systematic comparison of models help improve the science about modeling? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So you see what we find, and by the way, this is what climate modelers found a while ago. And then when we started doing this with all the ag modelers, what we find is when we combine the models with common rigorous protocols, so everybody is doing the same thing, the mean of the models does a better job in reproducing observed data than any single model across the group. And so definitely, and what we find also is the process of bringing the modelers together. So they learn, oh, well, how does your model do this? And then we work on specific parts of, for example, heat responses of crops, and then share the very best modules. So the whole thing has, I really think, brought the whole ag modeling to a new level.
By the way, we have dozens of questions in the chat. I'm going to apologize to the people who have sent questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. And if any of the speakers have questions they particularly want to answer, I invite you to take a look and just raise your hand and do that. But Philip, I thought another question from Maynard Clark might be interesting for you. He asked about vehicular use in the food system and kind of how that enters into the calculation, and what do we know about transportation emissions from the food system. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we've done some analysis that will be coming out in this Tubiello report that Cynthia referred to in later this month, that looked at basically what was the share of transport emissions that could be attributed to the food system. And to be frank, we didn't end up with a lot. Of that. Was a relatively small percentage, and surprisingly relatively consistent. We looked at it for China, we looked at it for Europe, and we looked at it for the United States. So relatively consistent across the 3 points. But I think that sort of highlights one of the issues where we need to do a better job of researching and do a more extensive job, because there has been a tendency to sort of separate out energy from food, and in thinking about food, to just think about emissions from tractors and the like. But the fact of the matter is, we know that there's a lot of transport of food, food inputs and the like from processing, and that's all related, obviously, to how much we're eating and what we're eating. It relates to what happens on the waste side and other things like that. So what we're trying to do as part of this food climate partnership is also to take a more holistic view of the food system, building very much on some of the work that Cynthia has been doing, and sort of see, can we get a better sense as to what's going on? If I could point out, one issue that is very popular these days is methane. And what's interesting is that there's a certain amount of methane that's associated with upstream oil and gas activities. And a certain amount of that oil and gas activities is to produce diesel and gasoline for tractors. So in some sense, if we move, for example, to electric tractors and the like on farm, not only are we saving emissions related to gasoline, but we may also be saving some of the upstream methane leakages that are occurring.
David Wallerstein, your presentation prompted a number of questions and comments. First, somebody said, I agree with David. Joanna Christina said, I agree with David. Do something today to help. If you're ever in the UK, David, I manufacture a very fine vegan haggis. So you have an offer for delicious food in the UK if you ever have a chance to get there. And then 2 specific questions on water that came in I thought were interesting. One is more general. Recently reported as glaciers melt, rivers are drying up. What are the implications for much of the world that depends upon glacier runoff? And then second, somebody asked specifically about water shortages in India. I don't know if you're familiar with either of those topics.
Here's how and water quality, drinking water. Here's how I look at it, really. I think we have to be so efficient now and thoughtful about how we use water. So, you know, and in most countries, you know, water is, you guys can correct this if this is wrong, but it'll be 40 to 70% of national water consumption is in the agricultural sector. So if you have technologies, like I was referring to these artificial intelligence driven technologies, maybe sometimes it's called precision agriculture, that could maybe save 20 to 40% on agriculture, and that's a big chunk of your national water expenditure. You've got a big solution on your hands to conserve water, and if your rivers are lighter, because of glacial melt, and that's anticipated to occur, you have to really take these kinds of solutions extremely seriously, because they do work and they're right in front of us. And there's been a lot of reluctance to get government support anywhere to explore them. The other thing about when you look at a country like India, I would have questions as a layperson to ask. One is, I would wonder to what extent, if a nation had heavy dependence on thermoelectric power, for example, and like coal, and was able to substitute that for, let's say, wind and solar, how much water can be freed from channeling through that power system that now can be applied to other tasks? This would be one question I'd have on a national basis if there was an initiative to go to renewables. So what I'm saying is that going to renewables like solar and wind that are non-water dependent has a water-related impact that maybe people don't appreciate enough. That's one point. The other point is, for farmers in India, I would wonder, do they need to pay for their water? We know that India is a water scarce country, but is the water in India metered? That is, if a farmer there uses more of it, are they penalized somehow? And if it's not done through money by metering it, what is that mechanism? Because you could say, okay, we're not going to penalize people through money, making them pay more if they waste the water, but we will make these systems intelligent, through and through. So we will only deliver the amount of water to a plant that needs water. Like, the plants will tell us how much water they need, and the farmer doesn't get to decide. So there's all kinds of ways that we can use technology to address this. But I would say, if you're not metering your water, of course, it's going to be wasted sometimes. And so sometimes the solutions are kind of right in front of our face, but we still don't address them fully. And so these are just questions I have about India. I've heard things about Pakistan, maybe in some parts of the country where they're not metering the water. I don't know if that's a national problem or a local problem, but these are just questions I would have. And there's a lot of things we can do with efficiency and using more market-driven mechanisms and technological mechanisms to ensure that we have more resilient water sources and we're more careful with using our water.
So anything in USDA happening on that front? Yeah.
A lot, yeah. So in many ways, the story of climate change in agriculture is this story of water. But it's not one story across the U.S. We have very different outcomes and very different issues regionally. So in the Northeast and many parts of the Eastern U.S., it's not a matter of not enough water. It's, in some cases, it's too much water or water that's coming at the wrong time. We've got in the Midwest, the issue is wet early springs that, where the farmers can't get in the field because they're waterlogged. In the Western states, we have different issues, especially in the Southwest, where, the climate change modeling is that it's going to get warmer and drier with lower snowpack. And so water supply issues are going to be more acute. We've been studying drought in the US and patterns of drought and also responses, and we're learning a lot about how to prepare for climate change. And so certainly genetics is really critical. The stronger the plant, the deeper the rooting system, the better they're going to be able to withstand drought. Conservation and soil health can help retain water in dry periods and help manage water when it's too wet. Data and information is critical, and so we're putting a lot of emphasis into drought monitoring, drought early warning systems, giving farmers advance notice so they can prepare. Technologies, new improved drip irrigation systems, some of the technologies that David talked about. And then finally, just ensuring that farmers have that safety net of insurance to help them manage drought and extreme events, because you want them to take risks. You want them to grow crops. And farming is risky, and with climate change, it gets riskier. But so you need to also balance that with how do you ensure that they have the security so they can take the risk and plant the crops and do what they need to do. So all of that is part of this sort of comprehensive approach we're taking within USDA to manage water and climate.
Your question about kind of the mitigation and adaptation brings in a great question we got from Matthew Hayek, he's a colleague, he's a professor of environmental sciences at New York University, and a colleague of ours and a co-author on the info guide. and a real leader on these issues. And Matthew asks, how can investments into food systems today pay dividends in the long term? If our goal is to decrease food system emissions, can this also improve resilience to buffer against future climate shocks? Any thoughts from anyone on how we both promote reducing emissions and improving resilience at the same time?
I'll just start off, then definitely Bill, come right in. I mean, the main one is soil carbon, is organic matter, because by increasing soil organic matter, that is then removing carbon from the atmosphere. But at the same time, so that's on the mitigation side. But at the same time, it increases the water holding capacity of the soil, thereby dealing with both the increased heavy downpours, which are already occurring, which is one of the climate change effects, and the potential in some regions for increased drought, such as the Southwest, as Bill says. So that's just like the poster child of the example of practice that does both mitigation and adaptation.
Philippe, I wanted to ask you about meat consumption, which we've talked a little bit about, and it's kind of been in the news, and in particularly the issue of meat consumption in developing countries. People talk about scaling back meat consumption in developed countries as part of addressing climate change, but how do you think about this from a development standpoint?
I think it's a tricky issue, and I think it's one of those where more information and more research will be required. And let me just point out why it's a tricky issue. Is because what you tend to see in poor developing countries is you tend to see less meat consumption, in particular from poorer people, and that as they become more affluent or less poor, they look to increase the amount of meat in their diet. So there's been a real appeal among poorer people as they become less poor, and in the indices of success is to increase the amount of meat in your diet. I mean, there's a view, obviously, you want to increase the amount of protein in your diet. And so, for example, what we've seen in China over the last, I think, 20 or 25 years is that meat consumption per capita has doubled as China has become increasingly not poor and moving into the middle class. Now, having said that, I think it's important, obviously, to distinguish between meat consumption per se and nourishment. And I think part of the trick is going to be how to sort of find a future pathway for developing countries, for people as they become less poor, to get the nutrients, the protein that they need in a low carbon manner. But it's clear the way this issue is playing out in developed countries and developing countries is very, very different. If I also just could come back quickly, it's a related point on the previous question, which is that in the developing country context, in particular the poor developing country context, the issue of resilience is an issue of food security. Food security is a critical issue. It doesn't really do a lot of good to talk about changes in technologies and if you're not dealing with the fundamental issue of food security and food insecurity. And clearly, climate change represents and generates a threat to the food security issue for so many poor people across the developing world.
David,
could I also do a follow-on to the
of course,
mitigation
and then
and
David, if he
adaptation?
wants to come in, yeah.
Yes, so really, yes, Philip, very much the food security of the pressure that climate change is already putting on the systems and especially in the developing countries. Just wanted to say one more thing about AgMIP is developing a program now called MACB. It's not the Big Mac. It stands for Mitigation and Adaptation Co-Benefits. And so what we're doing is really developing the capacity of the models to look at both of these things at the same time, because that's really, as we go forward with the transformation that we're all talking about, that's what we really have to think in an integrated way about all these effects at the same time. So just to say, we're working on that.
David, any thoughts about any of that? And then we have some questions in the chat about desalination, which I think would be interesting to get your thoughts on as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize, just to clarify what I was talking about with these AI type solutions, that they are solutions in the agricultural space that specifically affect the productivity of the plant. Just to say, it's not really about understanding soil and things like that for the sake of it. It is actually to effectively control the amount of nutritional resources that go to the plant, and listening to the plant and optimizing that for the plant. So this is something that is actively affecting that. Now you can tell humans what to do, when to turn on the water, when to apply the fertilizer, or you can totally roboticize it in a closed loop where the humans aren't even operating anymore. And we've shown in the Netherlands with WR that consistently humans outperform, the AI outperforms humans. But I just wanted to confirm that what I'm referring to there, not so much about an analytical solution, but really something that is affecting how you interact with plants. I just also wanted, that being said, I'm very interested in technology. It's what I do all day. But someone asked, what's the biggest thing to, this was Karina, right? Asked like, what's the biggest strategy for emissions reduction? That's the big question, isn't it, for the call? And I love to pose my answer and then a question to the other panelists here, because to me, the absolute clear answer in my mind is that it has to be reducing meat consumption. If you were to want to do one thing, forget culture and forget your preferences and the fact that you love barbecued ribs. Just say, like, if you really wanted to answer Karina's question, to me, it's you could go to zero on meat for a while. And Philippe mentioned the sensitivities and having that as a global message, but that's my view. Having thought about the role of technology and things like that is reducing meat intake. And if you took it to zero, it would have a significant impact on emissions globally. But am I crazy here, or am I onto something? I'd love to hear from the other panelists.
All right, Philippe, do you want to start, and Cynthia, and then Bill?
Yeah, you need to let me get in at some point on this one.
Of course.
Go ahead, Bill. Why don't you start, Bill?
You want to start?
You start, Bill.
I mean, that's certainly not the approach we're taking at USDA. I mean, there's a role for dietary choice, and the discussion in civil society is a healthy one to have. Certainly, there are health benefits to having a healthy diet, and there are definitely differences in the greenhouse gas profile of various sources of protein. The approach that we take within USDA is knowing that we need to work with farmers and that we need to bring farmers into the discussion and have a robust approach to how we're addressing greenhouse gas emissions. We work with farmers where they are and in their production systems, and there is a great amount of potential to improve the greenhouse gas profile of livestock systems, of all the various different ways of producing protein. And in fact, if you look across the globe, the emissions per unit of output, the emissions intensity of protein that's grown in the US or protein that's grown in Europe is very different than protein that's grown in other regions of the world. And so it's not as simple as saying meat or no meat. It really is not. And it's not necessarily, in my view, a particularly constructive conversation to have with farmers. Whereas if we look at how to improve the productivity, how to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity, how to employ technologies, there's a lot of space in there. And there's great potential to both address emissions, continue to have successful agriculture, and to move forward.
Bill, what technologies do you have in mind? Are you talking about feed additives?
So there's a variety. So I mean, one is just the intensity of production, right? And so more productive systems produce less greenhouse gas emissions per unit of output, whether that's meat or poultry or beef. So that's really critical. And there are vast disparities across the globe on that. When you get into livestock, two major sources of emissions: enteric fermentation, where there you're talking about feed additives, which are, a lot of them are on the cusp of being on the market. 3-NOP, lipids, fats, nitrates, all are shown to reduce methane emissions in the rumen. And then manure management is one area where you could actually convert that part of the emission cycle into energy. And so there's a great potential to move away from the anaerobic emission sources to systems that are capturing methane or decomposing of the manure aerobically. And then finally, on the grazing side, Rotational grazing, again, is a great strategy to increase soil carbon. So there are strategies within livestock operations that can enhance soil carbon.
So two program notes. So first, we got into a really big and important issue right at the end, and we're just about out of time. Second, it's worth highlighting that at the Center on Global Energy Policy, we provide a platform for a range of different views. We don't endorse any views. We provided a platform for intelligent statements of a wide range of views, so it's totally good to have different views. I want to, let's see, we only have a few minutes, but I want to give David a chance to respond, or Philip or Cynthia, whoever would like to jump in on this.
I'd just like to say, from working on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change with co-authors from Brazil, from India, from Africa, there is so many ways that and context specific for addressing the climate change challenges. So I really second what Bill is saying for around the world. Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, gender issues, all of these things have to be taken into account as we work together globally to transform the agricultural system and respond to climate change.
Philip, David, any closing thoughts you'd like to offer?
I mean,
go
ahead, David. Please go ahead, David.
Oh, if I could, maybe it's a question then for Philip, but I would say, if someone, just like Karina's question was like, what would be the best way if we had to do something to reduce emissions and do it quickly if we take climate change very seriously as human beings occupying a massive footprint on this planet? And we're saying, okay, David, it's not livestock because it's really complicated. There's so many things. Okay, then what would it be, guys? Like, we're going to stay away from that one. But what is that answer that we could give to Karina so she could go home, or that person could go home and say, okay, I'm going to start doing this, or I'm going to look into this, because I know we have to do things urgently because climate change is that ugly thing that's coming at us really fast. What would that answer be? That's my question.
Yeah, I do a whole presentation on harnessing the carbon cycle. And, basically it's, the biosphere is the only strategy to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. And you can see it in the Keeling curve. You can see it in the data. So there's tremendous potential to absorb carbon, to remove it from the atmosphere, and to capture the energy in it as it gets released. And so that's, I think, where the great potential from the land comes.
Oh, this is very frustrating that we are at the end here, ladies and gentlemen, because I want to take the moderator's prerogative to say I half agree with Bill, because I think you can get some quick reductions from the biosphere, but when you're taking fossil energy from underground and transferring it into the biosphere is not going to be a permanent containment of that. Fundamentally, on a permanent basis, you have to get it underground, back underground, or not remove it at all. So we can do a lot with these types of measures. I'm not sure we can do everything, but we will save this for another day. I want to thank our really extraordinary panelists for this incredibly lively conversation. Also, all of you who offered questions and answers in the chat. My name is David Sandalow. You've been listening to a session with Bill Hohenstein of USDA, Cynthia Rosenzweig of Goddard and AgMIP, Philippe Benoit of Center on Global Energy Policy, and David Wallerstein of Tencent and author of AI for Food, Energy, Water, producer of Day Zero. This event will be posted on video within a couple of days on the website of the Center on Global Energy Policy. Please check that out, and check out our info guide on food and climate change. Our next public event is going to be a book talk with Amy Myers Jaffe coming up next week. Look forward to that, and to seeing all of you at our future events. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Take care. Goodbye.